Hello and welcome to the ISJL Virtual Vacation. I'm Nora Katz, Director of Heritage and Interpretation at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. Recently, I've been wondering about how and where Southern Jewish and queer identities and histories intersect. It's a question I got to explore with Samantha Rosenthal, Associate Professor of History and Coordinator of the Public History Concentration at Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. Her new book, Living Queer History, Remembrance and Belonging in a Southern City, is a personal and far-reaching exploration of both Roanoke's rich queer history and her experiences interpreting and exploring that history as a queer public historian. Samantha Rosenthal is the author of Living Queer History and Beyond Hawaii, Native Labor in the Pacific World. She is also co-founder of the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ+ History Project, a queer public history initiative based in Roanoke, Virginia. Her work as an author and with the History Project has been recognized with awards and honorable mentions from the National Council on Public History, the Oral History Association, the Committee on Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender History, the American Society for Environmental History, and the Working Class Studies Association. She currently serves on the governing board of the Committee on Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender History and on the editorial board of The Public Historian. Samantha is a committed queer, feminist, and anti-racist activist and community organizer. They are particularly passionate about mentoring young queer and trans people in Southwest Virginia. I spoke to Samantha about Living Queer History, her work with the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ+ History Project, and the overlaps in the Venn diagram of queerness and Jewishness. Let's dive in. Samantha, I'm hoping to start that you can just introduce yourself and sort of pitch your book to people who might not know about it.
Sure. So I'm Samantha Rosenthal, calling in from Roanoke, Virginia, where I live, and I'm the author of Living Queer History, Remembrance and Belonging in a Southern City, which is a book about LGBTQ history in Southwest Virginia and my experiences coming to terms with that history.
I have so many questions for you. I'm trying to think about where to start, but I'm interested in having you talk a little bit about the very beginning of the book and like the vignette that you choose to open the book, talking about attending a family funeral in New York City and sort of learning about queer people and queer histories in your family. Can you sort of tell that story and talk about why that is the beginning of the book?
Yeah, so in the first few pages of the book, the book opens on a scene in Brooklyn, which is where my family is like historically from Central Brooklyn. And I was living in a sublet for the summer. This is about 5 years ago. I had just come out as trans, and I was living in Virginia at the time. But I went up to New York for the summer to write and see friends and go to the beach and stuff like that. And I only brought like women's clothes with me because I had determined that like maybe getting out of Roanoke, because I just come out, and going to another place and the anonymity of New York City with all those people, that I could maybe try out wearing women's clothes and like getting more into that embodiment as a trans woman. And then I got a call from my mom that a family member had died unexpectedly and that I should show up at the funeral in Queens. And I was like, oh, what am I going to wear? Because my family's only seen me in men's clothes previously. So I end up pulling together the best outfit I can, which is not really funeral appropriate clothes. But looking very feminine, and I show up and see my parents and my aunt and my uncle and my cousin later in the day, and we attend the funeral. And when I'm at the funeral and she's being buried, I notice a grave next to where she's being buried with the name Allen on it. And Allen was my uncle's brother. To put it briefly. And I had never really known about who this person was, except that, and then I flash back in the book in this, except that when I had first come out to my parents in 2014, so 3 years earlier than that, my mom had written me this super long, kind of combative letter in response saying like, if you're queer, you're going to end up like Alan. And I was like, who's that? And she described, he is a family member who had been in a straight marriage and everything. But then in the 1980s, he came out as gay. His marriage fell apart. He started dating men in New York and he contracted HIV and he died in 1989 from the AIDS crisis. And his memory had been kind of wiped from the story of our family that I grew up with. I didn't know anyone was queer in our family, and I felt so alone and afraid to come out into our family. So when I saw Alan's grave there, it was just kind of a moment of reckoning with the past for me to think about like here I am showing up in my trans embodiment for the first time with my family, and yet they all have this history going back decades and decades of engagement with queerness, a history of queer trauma, having a family member die of AIDS. And it was all just a mystery to me. And I wanted to know, you know, why is this history forgotten? Not even forgotten, but kind of erased. And that opened up questions for me that I brought back with me to Roanoke, to Virginia, where I live, to think about for all of us how queer history is either remembered or forgotten in different communities at different times, and why do queer communities or straight families or whatever, why do we make those decisions about how we remember the past? And so that's what the book is about.
I'm really interested in how your own sort of personal discoveries about gender and sexuality are kind of happening at the same time as you're moving south. And I'm wondering if you could talk about like moving to Roanoke and the things that you were learning about the South and also about yourself as a new Southerner.
Right, right. Yeah, there's a line in the intro where I say, I wasn't just a baby queer, but a baby Southerner. And in queer communities, like baby queer is a term that's used to talk about someone who's just kind of coming out and putting their feet in the water. But I was like, oh yeah, I'm also a baby Southerner, and I do still feel that way. I've been here for 7 years now, but I am a New Yorker. I'm a New York Jew. I think that that's an important identity in my familial history and my upbringing. So I came out first in 2014, and it was within a 12-month period, my marriage had fallen apart. It's kind of parallel to Alan's. My marriage fell apart. I came out as queer, as like a queer guy. I hadn't figured out yet that I was trans. And I finished my PhD and went on the job market and got this one job offer here in Roanoke, Virginia. And so it was like a flurry of change in that, I was divorced or separated and I moved down south, and I had just come out less than a year before I moved. So I didn't have a lot of time, in New York to get my feet wet to figure out like what kind of queer am I. And so the process of figuring out what kind of queer am I really was a Southern born process. I landed here in Roanoke. I had actually recloseted myself when I applied for the job. And so then that created the conundrum of like when I did show up, I had to figure out how to come out again and like come out at work and that kind of stuff. And very quickly, I started to meet tons of LGBTQ people here. Part of that was the strategy I took to meet people, which was to come up with the idea of doing an LGBTQ history project, which the book talks about. The book is based on 7 years or 5 years at the time I wrote it, of research by a community-based queer history project that we started in September, like a month after I moved here in 2015. And the project was a way for me as a historian to be like, I think to sort of subtly signal to people like, queerness has something to do with me, or that I care about this. It's a kind of subtle way to come out. And it also meant that people showing up for meetings, people who are passionate about queer history, were gathering together in these new spaces. And I'm looking around at the people in these spaces. I'm like, these are the kind of people I want to be around and get to know. And we can talk more about it too, but like the whole piece of coming out as a trans woman and discovering that I was transgender was really born out of that, our community here, and of that work. When I got to know older trans women, because we're doing interviews with them for history, for the Queer History Project, you know, by the time we got to maybe the third elderly trans woman that the project had interfaced with, it just hit me like a pile of bricks that I was like, I was hearing their story, I was hearing was also mine. And so they helped me to come out as trans. So yeah, the work of thinking about queer history in Southwest Virginia was fundamental to me figuring out who I am and how I want to live.
Can you introduce the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ plus history project and talk a little bit about your sort of public history activism?
So, I mean, I have a master's in public history from back in the mid 2000s, and I've worked at historic houses, and I was a professional walking tour guide, and I was an urban park ranger in the Bronx, and I've done all kinds of public history related things. But then when I showed up here in 2015 in Roanoke, and I was hired to teach public history and to run a public history program, an undergraduate program, I was like, well, what kind of work do I want to do locally? And I don't know anything about this community when I first got here. So, so I think it was born of that, plus born of the fact that I was kind of semi-closeted and needed to find more queer people, that I proposed a program at the Roanoke Diversity Center, which is an LGBT community center in Roanoke, that had actually just opened their doors 2 years before I got here. So it's also kind of equally new. I proposed a program for an evening there where I would introduce the idea of queer community history projects, because there's a long history, as I talk about in the book, going back to the 1970s, of communities all across the United States doing these community-based LGBT history projects. Although a lot of those projects that go back to the 70s and 80s were northern or West Coast and very metropolitan, and it's taken more time for communities like mine to do that work formally. So I talked to this audience. 18 people showed up at that, or 17 people at that event, and talked about some of the work that other cities and communities have done. And we took out big pieces of paper and magic markers, and I put people into groups and had them brainstorm. What do you want to know about queer history in Southwest Virginia? How do we want to do this? What do we want to call ourselves? How do we want to structure this? And after that 2-hour meeting, we left there with mandates to create an oral history collection. So then we had to figure out how to do that, to create an archive, because there was no standing archive of LGBTQ materials here. So we had to do that. And the folks in that room came up with the name Southwest Virginia LGBTQ plus History Project. And we just kept meeting once a month for the next, now 7 years since then, to keep trying to figure out what we're doing. But so, yeah, the project has involved something like 300 people to date as participants. We've done oral histories with about 50 elders in the community. We have an archive that comprises many, many cubic feet of boxes full of newsletters and flyers and activist like handwritten notes from meetings and stuff from 1971 to the present. And we've created exhibits, and we have free walking tours we do once a month that are led by all queer volunteers in the community. And we've done youth programming, and we have a podcast now, and it just kind of keeps going on because new people show up and get involved, and they have ideas, and we just keep going and going. So that's a synopsis of the project.
You talk about the importance of, referring to the first 17 people at that meeting as co-founders and not having a hierarchy. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why that's important to the sort of structure of the project and what the work you're doing.
There were meetings when we debated how to structure the project, and we never were able to come to any consensus around that. We talked about electing leaders, and always it got, the majority of people in the room were against that. We talked about having a budget, which could be useful, which we've never had, and having a treasurer, and it's always been, voted down. So we've operated, on a kind of horizontality approach that, for me, I picked up on when I was in New York. I was involved in Occupy Wall Street, which was very anarchist influenced in the way it organized. And I learned a lot about organizing, but from a kind of anarchist bent there. And so we do some of those things that we did at Occupy. We do that in the history project, like having leaderlessness, although we do have to have someone who puts their contact information on things. And that's often been me, but not always. There have been other times in the project when other people have been the spokesperson. And we have a kind of radical transparency that we practice. So we try to post all of our minutes from all of our meetings online. Everything is out there so people can trace, whether it's future historians or people now can trace what we've done and the decisions we've made. And we do check-ins at our meetings, and we prioritize, treating each other as kin, as friends, as lovers, as community, and not in, well, we're not all historians. I mean, many of us, very few of us, I would say, would identify as historians, but many maybe identify as activists who are involved. Most people who are involved identify somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. And so, the way it works is a kind of anarchic democracy of like whoever shows up at each monthly meeting has decision-making power. So if 5 people show up one month, those people are going to make decisions for what we're doing for the next month and the direction the project's making. So that's the way it's worked for 7 years, and it's worked out. I think for the project that we've never become a 501c3. We've never handled, whenever we've had money that we had to spend on something, we have people just donate in kind. Somebody pays the bill, and we Venmo them if we can chip in, and nobody's keeping track. And that's how we've handled money for 7 years. And so, I do think we've achieved a remarkable amount for being a kind of small regional volunteer-run LGBTQ history project, which is a very obscure thing. So, that's kind of how the project works.
The project is 7 years old now. I guess it was 5 years old when you were doing a lot of the work for this book, which is relatively young. And I'm wondering about why this felt like the moment to write this book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the COVID pandemic is a big part of me writing the book, because we had to step back from a lot of our work with the project when the pandemic began. The pandemic did influence us to start the podcast. Like, that was a pandemic project because we could do it virtually. But we stopped walking tours for over a year, and we stopped having meetings for a long time, and then tried Zoom, and project members just did not like meeting on Zoom. So we actually stopped that too, and we're back now in person, but kind of had maybe almost a year and a half or 2 years where we met very sporadically. So the project was in a kind of maintenance mode for a while, and that was a good opportunity to kind of, for me, stuck at home, to reflect on what we've done and what we've done well and what we haven't done well, and the politics of this work and the theory that underlines it, and reflect on my own experiences journeying through this work as a Southern queer historian, and how I've changed. So I think that's a big part of writing it. I often tell people that people ask me as a historian, well, what time period do you study and what time period is this book about? And I'll say, this is a book about the Trump era. because although the book reaches back into the past, and I would say primarily maybe the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the book is really about the late 2010s. I mean, I think that's the actual time period that I'm studying, because I'm looking at how LGBTQ people in the Bible Belt, in Appalachia, in Southwest Virginia, during the 4 years, give or take, including the run up to the election in 2015, 2016, and the aftermath, looking at that period of the Trump era here and how queer people navigated that time, thinking historically about our place here. And I think that that's actually a really important historical story. And it's weird as a historian to say that the Trump era is like a historical period that we can write about. But I felt a kind of urgency to tell that story after we've been through, the riot in Charlottesville and all the way up. The book I finished writing the book around the George Floyd uprisings in 2020. And just all of the kind of resurgence of white supremacy or explicit white supremacy, and the huge backlash against trans people, which is still ongoing. This was all happening in the last half of the 2010s. And so I thought, this is an important story about how queer history matters to a community like mine during a tumultuous time.
I think that's a great answer. I'm interested to hear you talk about the subtitle of the book, which is Remembrance and Belonging in a Southern City. Can you talk a little bit about those themes of remembrance and belonging and what those mean in the context of your work?
When we think about how people engage with the past, which is broadly what public historians are interested in how people think about the past, how we interpret the past, how we engage in it. When we think about that broadly, we focus a lot on remembrance, the first part of that. How do we remember? How do we interpret? Why do we put on historical reenactments? Why do people have the memories they do of what happened? But very early in this project, I started to think of erasure and not knowing and forgetting, amnesia, if you will, as really important themes in queer public history. And part of it is my experience with discovering my family member who had died of AIDS, a story that had been not told all through my 30-some years of my life. But part of it was also getting to know my community in Roanoke and realizing the levels of suppression that there was in terms of what people wanted to say. There's a lot that oral history narrators would shield and maybe not say, or you really had to build trust to get people to talk about those things. You have certain memories of from the elders here about what happened that are sometimes more those memories look more favorably upon them, and things like racism within the queer community, which I write a lot about, or transphobia within the queer community, or sexism within the queer community. Those things are not so readily told. It's don't tell that to everybody. We don't want to be seen that way. So as a historian, as a public historian engaging with the queer past, I thought that this is not just about remembrance, but it's about how we remember and what we don't remember. Now, the belonging piece is more about the contemporary day, the Trump era and ongoing. Was realizing in our work that the stories that the elders were telling and the material we were collecting was one side of a story of what was going on. The other side is all the young people who are involved in the project, who are leading the walking tours, who are doing the interviews, who are showing up again and again and again to say, queer history matters to me. And, so when I was writing the book, I really wanted to interweave stories of some of my friends who are involved in the project, including my ex, and talk about that love story too, how we met through the project. and myself to think about, for all of us who are in our 20s and 30s during the time of the project, like what is what does it mean to us? And I think the questions for queer youth and or just young people generally, I don't know how young I am anymore because I'm 39 now, so I'm really aging out of that. But in the book I talk about working with middle schoolers and high schoolers also in some of our projects. That's where the belonging piece came in a lot for me, was thinking about, oh, queer history matters because for younger people here, they're looking around and they're saying, is Roanoke a place that I can make a full life in? Is Roanoke a place that I can not just survive in, but, have a vibrant queer life here? Is Roanoke a place where, queer people belong? And so I was realizing that intergenerational conversation between what we were learning from the past and what the young people today, why they were getting involved in the project, was that interplay between remembrance and belonging. It's about how we think about the queer past and use the queer past to create a better world today and a better world in the future for all the queer and trans people who are still here and who are coming up. And that's something that I honestly think about every day because I live here as a trans woman and as a queer trans woman in Roanoke, Virginia in the 2020s. I have a big trans flag outside of my house and I mentor queer youth here. And it's a daily pressing question for us about how do we live here safely and have vibrant community and repair the wrongs of the queer past and all of this. And I think that queer history provides tools for all of that work today.
I was really, I think, surprised by the really rich queer history of Roanoke that you outline in the book. Living in the Deep South, this is not a place that feels like there's not a very visible queer history here, although of course there is one. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that history is in Roanoke and that kind of long legacy of queerness in Southwest Virginia.
Sure. I mean, first of all, the thing that I always say to people when they ask about Roanoke is, I don't think Roanoke is exceptional. I don't think so. The fact that I wrote a book about queer Roanoke seems odd because it is a small city. It's just 100,000 people, and it's in Southwest Virginia, which is a very marginalized, like politically and economically and culturally marginalized part of the country. And so it's like, wow, Roanoke has all this stuff going on. But I really truly believe that I think every southern city and small cities and towns have this history. My friends in Alabama with the Invisible Histories Project are doing great work in Mississippi, Alabama, and West Georgia. So in your region, like trying to tell some of those stories. And yeah, and I even have maybe some tidbits about Jackson in my head too, that I've read about. So I think the queer history is everywhere, but what's not always done is that communities are not always mobilized around the collective work of like exploring it and investigating it. It makes me sad, actually. Sometimes I think that I see a lot of like universities that do this work, and it's not always fully engaged in the community. And so it's like a class project, or it becomes a thing that lives on a college website or something, but it's not actually, but most people in the community still don't know like what's going on, like what does this have to do with me? So I think if anything's exceptional in Roanoke, it's that we've been so deliberate in making this project, the process of how we do this project, in a way to intentionally try to mobilize intergenerational togetherness and community organizing and making new spaces of belonging around the investigation of the queer past. So that's my pitch for like people who are watching this, wherever you live in the South, to think to find out, is there a project locally? And if not, I'm sure that there are elders who have some stuff to start with, and you could start a project like this. But what makes Roanoke, what's Roanoke's queer story? I mean, I think that, Roanoke is interesting because we are the largest city, although we're 100,000 people, which is a small city. I think we're the 8th largest city in Virginia, so it's nothing remarkable. We are the largest city within about a 2-hour plus drive in any direction. So you have to go to Richmond to the east, or down to Greensboro or Durham or something to the south, or out to Charleston. Well, actually, we're bigger than Charleston. We're bigger than all the West Virginia cities. So, yeah, and we're probably the biggest city, even for some of the closest big city for some of the folks in East Tennessee, Eastern Kentucky. So it is unique in that way, and Roanoke has long been a hub. It's historically a railroad hub, which is how Roanoke began as a city. It's one of those New South post-Civil War railroad hubs like Atlanta, and people in the 1880s thought Roanoke was going to grow like Atlanta, and it didn't. But we are a railroad city. I mean, we still have a little bit of that, and the railroad heritage is huge. So that history of us as a hub, and we're still a major hub on Interstate 81 right now. It cuts through Appalachia and goes through Roanoke. We're still a big hub, and so queer people have historically congregated here. We have tons of stories of people growing up in West Virginia, in rural Virginia, in North Carolina, who got on Greyhound buses back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and showed up in Roanoke. They looked around and they said, this is, I should go here. And so scholars write about a great, quote, great gay migration that took place after the Stonewall Uprising in 1969 in New York, where all these gay people around the country realized that, like, I got to get my butt to New York or get my butt to San Francisco. And I think Roanoke had a little microcosm of a great gay migration, with lots of rural queers saying, hey, I gotta get my butt to Roanoke. That's the nearest hub. So we have a gayborhood. We have a gay neighborhood that has existed, in at least in gay people's knowledge, since the early 70s. So for 50 years, it still has a disproportionately gay demographic here today, including myself. And we had at its peak 6 gay bars in walking distance of each other in the late 1970s in Roanoke. Today there's maybe 1 or 2. So just a surface look into Roanoke's history, we started to see some of those patterns. But other things I can say about it that we're still grappling with is, and you probably find this in other southern cities and communities, Roanoke's queer community has a long history of racial segregation, just like you would find in straight communities. I don't know why we might imagine that would be different. And so the spaces of queer belonging historically here were shaped by Jim Crow. And our gay neighborhood was a historically all-white neighborhood, and when it began as a gay neighborhood, was still all white. Our earliest gay bar was all white. So we have to reckon with that history of how Jim Crow and racial segregation and racial discrimination is part of the LGBTQ story in Southern communities. So yeah, there's a lot we can say.
Can you talk a little bit about how that reckoning has happened, like in the context of the project and the work that you've done to kind of uplift Black voices and other people of color in the project?
Absolutely. So, there's a chapter in the book called The Whiteness of Queerness. And that chapter, I also talk a bit about being Jewish, because I think that's, my reckoning with my own whiteness has been a journey of thinking about how my Jewish family became white historically after immigration, and the kind of choices my family members have made to become white and really assimilate into and take advantage of the privileges and powers of whiteness as Jews in America. So that's kind of how I get at whiteness. But then moving to the South, I write about like, okay, I really don't know what's going on now, because like, it's one thing as a New Yorker, as a Jewish New Yorker, to really work through thinking about the intersections of Jewishness and whiteness in a community where there's so many Jewish people. And New York is so Jewish, this is culturally, and then moving down here, and it's like, oh, I don't really have anyone else to talk to about this in Roanoke, about these intersections. So anyway, that's my own deal. But yeah, I think that what I write about in that chapter is that historically, and still today, there are many ways that LGBTQ gets read as white and gets coded as white. And there's a kind of unthinkingness around race sometimes. I say a kind of racial myopia. So there's a kind of blindness to thinking about the intersections of race with LGBTQ histories and presents and futures. And so in Roanoke, it's very clear to me when I moved here and I looked around and I looked at the queer organizations and the queer bars and spaces and everything around me. Every organization and every space that I could find when I first moved here was led by a white cis gay man. And I thought, oh, that's like reproducing some other kinds of hierarchies here, like patriarchy and white supremacy and, whatever. So it's something that our project has also had to grapple with, because when we opened the doors for our project and started, it was primarily, and at sometimes all at some of our meetings, all white queer people. And from the get-go, questions were raised in our meetings about what are we going to do? How are we going to engage with Black queer history? Roanoke City is about 1/3 Black and historically has been for a long time, around there, 25-30% Black. And the other thing I should know too is like all of the historic gay bars and the gay neighborhood, all these things are in parts of the city that historically were off limits to Black people. There's a whole geographic part of the city, much as you find in other southern cities, that was the historically Black part of the city, and still today is like super majority Black. And there have been none, and still are no queer spaces, formal queer spaces in those neighborhoods. So how do we do queer history today in a way that intervenes in that history rather than reproduces it? That's the question, right? We don't want to reproduce white supremacy in the way we're doing the history. And yet we looked around at ourselves at our meetings, and we looked at our early oral history narrators who are almost all white, and the people donating materials to the archives who were all white, and thinking, oh, we are reproducing this. We are doing it. It's that easy when you're not thinking about it. I mean, I say that as a white person, it's that easy to be that blind to it. So starting in late 2016 and then much more intentionally in 2017 onwards, we began a couple initiatives to engage explicitly with Black queer community here. And that chapter begins with me having like a coffee date with one of the very visible Black queer leaders here in Roanoke, and just saying, hey, I know we haven't talked before, and we've been doing this project already for like almost a year and a half, and have never reached out to you, and like, sorry. And he's like, yeah, what the and and beginning to repair that harm that we had already created by not doing that work from the get-go. And so he eventually agreed to be a kind of broker for the project and to work his Rolodex of Black queer elders. And then we did a whole round of interviews with Black queer elders, and which we've continued to do, so that to this day now, we've done over 50 interviews, and we try to maintain at least 25 to 30% of all of our interviews, so equal to the total population in Roanoke, that 25 to 30% of all of our oral histories need to be with Black people. But obviously, it's not enough, and it's not appropriate to just extract stories and extract material from folks. We want to create community and new spaces of belonging that are inclusive of queer people of color today. So we've applied for grants several times from the Campaign for Southern Equality, which is a queer Southern activist organization. Grants specifically to give money to Black queer people to do queer historical work. We've used that money to train young Black queer women to become oral history interviewers. And they then created their own professional interviews with Black queer elders. We've got money to give to Black queer women to put on a series of community dinners that would bring Black queer women together in space, in formal gatherings in a way that had never happened historically. And I'm really happy to say that, and this is mostly beyond when I finished writing the book, but the gentleman who was the first Black queer person to really become a leader in the project, who I mentioned before, he ended up founding an explicitly Black LGBTQ organization here in 2020 at the House of Expression, which is a ballroom house. And they're doing great. They're going on now 2+ years. And for the first time ever in Roanoke, there's now an explicitly Black queer organization. And so we see our role now as, because our project still is mostly white queer people, that foundation hasn't shifted that much. But now there's this vibrant Black queer organization that we are able to, when we get money now, we give it to the House of Expression. And we are constantly trying to find ways to promote and support and finance, if we can, their work so that Black queer people are doing what they want to do to mobilize history and community and make new spaces of belonging. So that's kind of been the journey that we've had in regards to race relations in Roanoke's queer community.
I want to kind of dive into Jewishness a little bit. When we were talking about doing this interview, we were both joking about the Venn diagram of Jewishness and queerness, and I'm wondering if you can talk about, like, in your mind, what that Venn diagram looks like and like what the overlaps are.
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts why that is too, because I think it's true that there's a big Venn diagram of queer and Jewish. And people have asked me why, and that's not something I've studied, so I don't really know. But it's been true for me. So when I was coming up in the world, I feel like a lot of the first queer friends I made, and for me that was honestly in college. Before college I was sheltered from all of that. But in college, I had a lot of queer women friends, and they were all Jewish. And this was at a school where there wasn't a lot of Jewish students. And I remember I got more, I was not really raised religiously, but in college, I got more interested in going back to it. And then I would go to these Friday night, Shabbat gatherings at my campus, which are very small gatherings of Jews. And it's like, oh, so many queer people here. It's probably like majority queer. Like, what is this? But still, I was closeted and hadn't, discovered that about myself. Yeah, so and since I've come out, I've had Jewish queer lovers, and it's there's always something really sweet there of a kind of knowingness, of just a familiarity of maybe of experience, of being with someone who's also Jewish and queer. And it's interesting here in Roanoke, I was thinking about this before we would talk today. I was thinking, okay, how many Southern Jewish queer people do I know here? And I think there's 2 others that I know of, and that's not bad for a city of 100,000. And like, I hosted a Passover Seder last month and co-led it with one of those Jewish queer friends of mine, and we had a very queer Haggadah that we co-created, and um, and pulled upon both of our kind of upbringings and things that were traditions for us. And everyone else at the Seder was queer, but not Jewish. And that's what it typically is like at my holidays. Is it feels almost like a queer holiday more than a Jewish one. And those are the people I want to be around. They're my family, you know, my queer family and my chosen family. So there's a kind of interesting, there's a lack of discordance there. I don't really feel any sense of like, oh, this is strange that all the people at my Seder are not Jewish, because it feels mostly like a queer ritual that has roots in Judaism, and I think that would describe my Jewish practice very well today.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of my queer friends and family are Jewish, and a lot of my Jewish friends and family are queer. And like you were saying, like it feels very natural. Like I don't really think about that. But I do think that in kind of both communities, there's a lot of thinking about like identity and community, like in a way that in many contexts feels very similar almost. I don't know if that's entirely accurate, but it feels like there's some kind of, they seem very connected in my mind.
They do to me too. Yeah.
We were also talking about like, and I think this is a similar thing that like when you add Southern to the Venn diagram, to me, it feels like these questions about like memory and community also feel like that's a very Southern thing. I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that, see, when I think about memory and community, I think Jewish. You know, like the little bit that I was raised with, you know, the way my parents put it to me when my brother and I were growing up was that they just want us to know where we come from. They want us to know our history and be proud of it. And so there was always a sense for me around Jewishness that it's about a kind of engagement with the past, in a way that I don't know what that's like for people of other faiths, if that's similar. It's not about an engagement with the biblical past for me. That's not what I'm saying, but an engagement with, you know, immigration from Eastern Europe, an engagement with the Holocaust, an engagement with those history, Ellis Island, like those are parts of my family's story, and what they carried with those immigrants brought over with them, you know, and the food they ate and and the Yiddish they spoke and stuff like that. So Jewishness, I think, was implanted in me always as like a very historical project. It's about memory. It's about remembering our family because we're dwindling and dying out. You know, it's that kind of thing. But whether Southernness is also about memory and community is something I don't know. I'm gonna have to think more about that. You know, I'm at the end of the day, I'm not a Southerner, right? I mean, I think Southerners are very strict about that. Like, I think I'll always be a New Yorker who's living in a Southern community. But some of the Jewish queers that I've met and loved over the past 7 years in the South, you know, did grow up here. And I guess just what I've seen from them is that, you know, it's the experience of being a very marginal minority, which is different than my experience growing up in New York, whereas like everyone's Jewish. You know, it's like you go to someone's bat mitzvah and it's like, oh, everybody from school is here. But I think for the Southern queer Jews that I know, you know, there's a kind of a smallness and tightness to the community. You know, I've heard some Jewish summer camp stories, which relates very much to my experiences in New York too. So I'm not sure that's different. Those are real queer spaces, Jewish summer camps. Those are spaces of like people figuring out that they're queer. That somebody should write about that. But yeah, so I think that the Venn diagrams are interesting, but I'm not sure I fully understand all of the intersections.
We actually recently did an episode about Jewish summer camp in the South, and
Great.
Well, so we did an episode all about sort of Jewish summer camp, and then we did an episode recently about sort of Southern Jewish romance more generally, but featured a whole thing about how summer camp is a place where that happens, and definitely some kind of stories about queer campers and like what summer camp was for them. It's
Great.
So many cool stories. There's a thing you talk about in the book. I'm trying to figure out how to kind of phrase my thinking on this, but there's a moment in the book where you're talking about, the project is such an archival project. There's a real emphasis in a lot of the work you do about kind of collecting. And you talk about how sort of placing so much importance on the printed word means that a lot of stories get lost, and like that's why oral history is so important. And then I also got to thinking about how like Judaism is like the people of the book, and we think so much about text, and like I don't know how those things like play together, if they play together. And I don't know if you have thoughts about like how the written word is a part of this.
That's interesting because, I hear you saying, that Judaism, we're the people of the book. But like, I think that Jewish culture is also so oral. It's passed down familially. I mean, I'm sure that the temple and the rabbinical scholars and the summer camps and all those other like non-home spaces and authorities have influenced, but they didn't really for me that much. I mean, I think I would say the family, the home, and in that case, oral tradition. My grandma who passed away last month, who's 98, I've been thinking about what she's told me about her life since the 1920s as an American Jew, as like a second generation American Jew. That history is it's oral. So it's an interesting mix. And then I think, so queer history, I mean, historically it's oral because it's about people, gathering together in somewhat secretive locations and finding out, you find out where you can gather through a kind of oral network. If you wrote things down, it could be evidence, you could get arrested, right? And so when we're thinking about the long 20th century, at least, we know that the way queer people found each other and in cities like Roanoke and small communities, that was very oral. And then on the other hand, there's written sources. So like, there were gay guidebooks that were published in the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s. There was a bar in Roanoke that's listed in these national gay guidebooks as early as, I think, the early 70s. And so, and it's interesting because the guidebooks, I think, misrepresent like what, I think Roanoke's like a backwater in the view of these like national guidebooks. And so that's an example where the written text is actually kind of very biased from a kind of metropolitan coastal perspective, whatever. And, the oral stories that would be told in that bar, if you did show up there, be much more local and much more integrative into of people's lived experiences. So, the other thing too is that I'm just like rambling about this topic, but it's very fascinating because, like, as a historian, even in academic history practice, we overemphasize written text as truth. And I always have to tell my students, the fact that someone wrote something down is as reliable as if someone just said it to me. There's no reason why we should think that the people who wrote anything down knew it better or more authoritative writing versus speaking. It's different ways of knowing and sharing. Okay, but anyway, to get back to the LGBTQ history, like the other thing that happens here is that certain LGBTQ stories are written down and other ones aren't. So if you look at our archive here in Roanoke that we've amassed, and I'm proud of the archive we've collected, but if you wrote a book just based on the written materials we've collected, you would know a lot about white, professional, cisgender, gay men and women. That's it. You would not learn a lot at all about queer people of color here historically. You would not learn a lot at all about trans people and non-binary people. You would not learn a lot about sex workers, et cetera, et cetera. And if you read my book, I hope people come away and they're like, wow, this book was a lot about trans sex workers and people of color. And in order to do that history, we have to do oral history. We have to interview people because the fact is that, queer people over time have lived in their little cliques and have had implicit biases and have told the stories their way, which have excluded so many other facets of our queer community over time. So to resurrect these stories, we need both. We need to find the old newsletters and the old flyers, but we also urgently need to interview people, and particularly the most marginalized people in our LGBTQ communities, and to preserve those stories, because I think that our queer histories are much more rich and complex and difficult than the kind of white gay history that often gets, told.
I think that's a great answer to that question, and kind of something that I think a lot about in my work as like a Southern Jewish public historian is thinking about the importance of like local and regional histories, and especially telling these stories in the places where they happen, and also like keeping archives locally rather than having them be in like a central national place. And you talk about that in the context of Southern queer history as well. And I'm hoping you can talk about why it's important to be doing this, like specifically in Roanoke, specifically in the South.
Yeah, I think that local is very important. And it took me a while to get there. I mean, I think when I got my PhD in history, like, I think that I was trained in many ways to think that a story like Roanoke, Virginia's queer past is maybe too small, and that I want to think that it's more valuable to think about kind of larger processes of things going on or whatever. And my doctoral dissertation was like very much looking at global history. So I think there's a way that I think academic historians sometimes put their nose up at the local, say like, oh, that's for amateurs, but that's not like as scholarly or as important. And I've become a huge advocate for local history, and I think because it provides a kind of meat of like of engagement for people where we live, around a sense of place and around a sense of community and belonging and all these key questions. And I know people have these questions about, why do I live where I live? Like, is this where I want to be? Like, do I have community here? How do I find that? Do I belong in this place? And I think that local history is a really important tool in exploring those questions. It tells us why our communities are fractured the way they are, right? We have a lot of people in Roanoke constantly doing work around the histories of the displacement and disenfranchisement of our Black community here, because when you learn that history, you realize why the city is geographically the way it is. You realize why there's a food desert in Northwest Roanoke, that's the majority Black area, you realize why the political system is set up the way it is in Roanoke, et cetera, et cetera. So doing that local historical investigation, it is a form of activism. It brings communities together to understand what happened, to figure out how to repair what happened, which is urgent work in Roanoke and other communities, particularly around racial segregation, and how to take a path forward. Like, what do we want? You know, I get very nerdy about like urban planning meetings, and I write a lot about the history of urban planning in the book. But like when Roanoke is thinking about like, what do we want these neighborhoods to look like in the next 10, 20 years? I'm like, please, let's think about the past, because like so much wild stuff has happened and bad decisions have been made before. Like, let's think about like, how do we use the past to think about building the kind of communities that are more just and more diverse, and the ones that we really want to live in and that we can still afford to live in, et cetera. So I think there's so many applications of local history, which is why I say it's activist work, because it's necessary for city government to know this history. It's necessary for our neighborhood organizations to know this history. It's necessary for, you know, people who are running for office in their communities to know this history. So I think local history is very empowering, and it's also it's at a scale that people can get involved and not feel alienated from it, like it's something out there other than themselves. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I would love to end on kind of this note is maybe broad and maybe it's like kind of mean because of how broad it is, but there's a beautiful moment in the book where you write about this group of trans teens that you had just led a workshop with, sort of joyfully swimming together at camp. And you talk about, you know, thinking like 40 years ago, trans people didn't have a space like that one. And I'm curious about your thoughts about kind of the future of queer history and kind of what role do you hope the History Project and your work will play in that?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. You know, one of the campers from that camp from many years ago, who I'm like still in touch with on social media, recently messaged me to say that they had seen, you know, someone in their rural county with a copy of my book in their hands, like a young queer person. I was like, yes, you know. So it's urgent. It's ongoing, urgent work, very urgent. You know, I wrote a piece for The Conversation, which is an online magazine, back in December about trans youth in Appalachia in this current moment, and what power transgender history can have, local, regional trans history can have for trans youth at this time when so many of our southern states are passing, you know, heinous legislation. You know, in Alabama, right next to you, they just passed a law making it a felony to prescribe gender-affirming care to trans youth. And so, you know, the political work necessary to reverse this trend and to create a safe communities for trans youth in the South today is going to take much more than public history. So I don't want to suggest that public history is going to, you know, is going to fix this stuff. And you know, and it's why, like, you know, I'm in touch with the Virginia ACLU and, like, you know, doing political work that's not always historical, because we have to respond to this crisis of this sort of anti-trans backlash, which is very centered in the South. We have to respond to that urgently and effectively. But I do think that trans history has a really important role there, because the very narrative that's being told about the issue of trans youth today, especially in rural and conservative and many Southern and Appalachian communities, is that this is some kind of new craze, that's overtaking our children, and that, you know, the LGBTQ community are groomers, right? Who are forcing gender conversion upon our kids who, you know, are not at an age when they can make those decisions. And the fact of trans history in a place like Southwest Virginia, and I write about this in this article, is that our oral histories tell stories of trans youth, their elders today, who grew up as trans kids in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s in Appalachia. They grew up in rural West Virginia as a trans youth, trying to figure out a way to dress the way they wanted to sneak around and not get caught and not get arrested, and find other people that they could be the gender that they see themselves as around those other people in safe ways. And it's a really, really difficult time and difficult history for those folks, but it's absolutely evidence that, you know, trans youth have been here for many, many generations, that at least that we know of. And we could probably go back further if we could find out. And so, you know, when people say that, oh, you know, transness is being imported from New York, or that it's, you know, being imposed upon kids, it's like we have a local history that belies those falsehoods, and that shows that there's 100 years of trans people making community, making spaces, finding each other, finding hormones, finding surgeries, making money however they could, protecting each other, caring for each other, building families together, right here in Southwest Virginia. And, you know, so I'm not going to stand any politician saying that, you know, this is some kind of new phenomenon that we need to legislate out of existence.
Will you tell people where they can find the book and your work and the history project and all of those things?
Absolutely. Well, I would love for you to support your local independent bookstores throughout the South, of which there are many. So if they don't have Living Queer History in stock, you can always ask your independent bookseller to order it for you, and that way they make a little bit of money and stay in business. But it's also available online wherever books are sold. You can order Living Queer History. If you want to support Roanoke's independent bookstore, Book No Further, in downtown Roanoke, they have signed copies for sale, and you can order those online if you go to Book No Further, and if you want to pay a little extra and support Roanoke. But yeah, so the book is out there, and I encourage you to get a copy, or ask your local library to get one, or get to your local bookstore to get one. The History Project is online. If you Google Southwest Virginia LGBTQ plus History Project, we have a website where you can access the digital archives and see all of the historic newsletters from the 70s and 80s and 90s. You can listen to and read the oral history interviews, all of them. You can view digital exhibits. You can listen to our podcast, etc. We are also on Facebook, Southwest Virginia LGBTQ History Project, and also on Instagram. So you can find the project in those places. So that's my little pitch.
Samantha, thank you so much for doing this. It was lovely to meet you.
It was nice meeting you. Thanks.
My thanks to Samantha Rosenthal for sharing her expertise and experiences with us. You can find out more about the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ+ History Project and Samantha's work at the links in the video description. And you can purchase your own copy of Living Queer History at your local independent bookstore. This project was made possible by a grant from the Mississippi Humanities Council through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The next episode of the ISJL Virtual Vacation premieres on Tuesday, June 28th. It's a deep dive into the Jewish history of South Florida with a musical twist. Stay tuned for more details coming very soon. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time for more stories from the Jewish South.